Japan, China through journalist eyes, which sounds a rather sort of controversial, maybe, title. But I think it's a very important theme. As you still remember, most of you, or I hope many of you, remember the exchange between the ambassadors of Japan and China in a British newspaper that eventually led to BBC television interviews. And today I was lucky enough to introduce those three distinguished journalists sitting here, chaired by also a distinguished academic. So can I just briefly introduce the chairperson, Professor Barry Buzan, who is a very good friend of Daiwa, who is an Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, LSE, and Political Science. Honorary Professor at Copenhagen and Jylland Universities, and a Senior Fellow at LSE Ideas. So I will leave Barry to introduce the speakers and hand it over to you. Would you like to come over here, or okay?
We're okay here. Okay, thank you very much, Shihoko, and welcome to you all. And thanks to Shihoko, as always, for organizing this with the customary efficiency that we associate with the Daiwa Foundation. So today we've got three journalists to speak to us about relations between China and Japan as they see it through the eyes of their profession. To my immediate left, we have David Pilling, who is the Asia editor of the Financial Times. In the middle, Dominic Ziegler, who is the Economist Asia editor. And on the end, Michio Hayashi, who is in Europe as the Bureau Chief for Yomiuri Shimbun. Each of them will speak for 10-15 minutes. If anybody goes on longer than that, I should start waving a piece of paper around. So we should have about 45 minutes at the end for discussion. I think the context for this is pretty straightforward. Anybody who follows relations between China and Japan knows that they have been bad for a long time and that they are getting worse. And that this is a pretty big problem, not just for the region, but also for the world. So these two countries are big enough that they matter not only to each other, but to everybody else. The worrying thing, at least from my point of view, I'm not a journalist, so I'm talking here as an academic, but the worrying thing from my point of view is that these bad relations seem to be spiraling down deeper and deeper into the two societies. So we have nationalists on both sides who are feeding each other, legitimizing each other, justifying each other, and there's a classical security spiral, as it's put in the jargon of my trade, where the action-reaction process makes things worse and worse and worse. And it isn't clear how one breaks this cycle. The context for it, in a very general sense, is the much discussed shifting power balance, with China rising and Japan not. I won't say Japan is declining, but it's certainly not rising anymore. And so in the relative power game, for those of you who like to think in realist terms, China is rising and Japan is getting relatively weaker. And this happens, for those who like to think in power politics terms, this is already an unsettling circumstance at the best of times. But in this instance, it's amplified by the fact that quite what kind of power China is going to become remains very uncertain to everybody, including the Chinese, I think, in the sense that this is a country that is unfolding and evolving very rapidly. It's full of contradictions, it's full of dynamism, and although you're not allowed to say so in China, it's full of capitalism. And it isn't quite clear how this particular peculiar novel mix is going to work out. So what we have is a rising power with a rather uncertain character. You can make a plausible case that China will end up in any one of several different forms, some of them fairly benign and some of them really quite nasty. The cases for each of these are, at least in my view, as plausible as each other. So that's the general background against which these two societies relate to each other, and I think at this point I will turn it over to our panel to see what their take on this is. So, Michio, if you would like to start.
Sure. I would like to explain to you mainly about what is happening in the world of Japanese media, because information in Japanese language don't travel that far compared to English language media. And I'm sure you have seen on the website a couple of questions Shihoka-san raised, and I will speak in the format of answering each of one of these questions. The first one is that on the question of how Sino-Japanese relations are reported in media, I'll speak about how it is reported in Japanese media in two parts. One, Senkaku Islands, and the other one, Yasukuni Shrine. The Japanese media are almost unanimous without a signed agreement that we support in principle our territorial integrity as a matter of principle. This attitude applies to the ongoing diplomatic exchange over Senkaku Islands, while the government of Japan's position is that there is no territorial dispute here. The main political parties, including Liberal Democratic Party and Komeito and Democratic Party of Japan, are in line with this position. It's not difficult to believe a nation's voice is united when it comes to issues like territorial sovereignty. The relative harmony in views held by media is the reflection of the public opinion. The reason why I keep using the word like almost unanimous and the relative harmony is that there have been notable exceptions to it. The most well-known political leader who made such exceptions was former Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama. He said in a June 2013 interview with Hong Kong TV that Japan should return what it stole from Jin dynasty, and then he did it again in a speech in Beijing. You may remember, if you're familiar with this show, the government reacted with very strong words, accusing him of being irresponsible. In the media, there were efforts to look back to history, examine what the facts are. On the internet sphere, there were accusations that some media spoke like Mr. Hatoyama. However, the basic and simple fact is that no major newspaper said Senkaku Island belongs to China. And why? Firstly, the simple fact is that media, especially those who sell millions of copies daily, can't sustain a line or be too distant from its readers in choosing what topic to cover and deciding how they should cover it. And I show you some of the recent opinion polls which media organization conducted and followed carefully. Unfortunately, Japan's public opinion is hugely against China. In one opinion poll by the Yomiuri Shimbun and Gallup of the United States, conducted in 23rd November 2013, after China's Air Force established the Air Defense Identification Zone, jaw-dropping 87% of more than 1,000 people polled nationally by computer-generated random phone number selection process replied that our relations with China was poor. That covers relatively poor and very poor. So they were in two parts. In the same opinion poll, the answer to the question, do you trust China? 88% gave a negative answer. And asked what the single most important concern you have about China, 89% raised territorial issues with neighboring countries. Secondly, China's military assertiveness is becoming more and more visibly clear, while Japan continues its battle to get itself out of the 2-decade-long stagnation. The sense of threat is tremendous. While the country tries to regain its confidence in the economy for the last 2 decades, newspapers worked hard through series of articles, editorials, and opinion pieces to raise issues and give warnings and proposals on how the nation could save younger generation, for example, from the status of working poor, or to solve the unsustainability of social security and healthcare, how to counter the decline in population, and all the serious concerns we have. As someone who reads one newspaper every day, I can tell you that anxiety and pessimism toward the country's future has been all over, unfortunately. We also speak about the loss of manufacturing bases to emerging economies, how to generate and pay for energies, etc. as well. Excuse me. On the other hand, China looms so large. There's a general worry about China that is 10 times larger than Japan in terms of population, almost twice as big as Japan in terms of GDP now, that is on the way to become a formidable military power with more modernized sets of fleets and weapons, coupled with high ambition demonstrated by the President Xi Jinping. The news of China's military assertiveness around Senkaku or elsewhere, more importantly, a supposed willingness to challenge the international order, including maritime rules and the role of America as Asia's security guarantor, is a huge psychological burden to many of us. Here again, I use the word many, and the reason why I do so is in the same opinion poll the Yomiuri conducted, around 9% of those who answered said they didn't know a thing about Senkaku Islands. But overwhelming majority in Japan, the question of Senkaku Islands and the larger task of how to deal with China as a neighbor is a huge one, and it will take enormous political, diplomatic, and fiscal and human resources to handle this question well. And for us, the question is about our own immediate security. Very importantly, there's a growing worry about America's commitment to security treaty with Japan. I'd like to show you another set of number of an opinion poll conducted by the Yomiuri Shimbun and Gallup in December 2013, when asked about the influence of the world of America, influence in the world of America, Japan's role security guaranteed by the treaty, 47% in Japan said they felt it was on the wane, while in the US itself, the number was even higher at worrying 57%. And there's a gap in perception about each other in terms of relationship with China. To the question, which country do you think will be more important to your country politically? 55% of Americans replied China, while only 40% chose Japan. In Japan, 65%, almost 2 in 3, said America will be more important politically, and only 22 said China will be more important to them. If you look at the question, which country do you think will be more important to your country economically, only 28% of Americans said it would be Japan, while 67% said China. To the same question, 44% of the Japanese said America would be the more important, but almost equal number of people at 43 replied China will be more important. Other diplomatic moves by Vice President Biden in Tokyo and Beijing about China's air defense identification zone may have enhanced anxiety in Tokyo, as some media reported suggested. There are many articles on this topic at a very constant pace. Now, I would like to move to another issue where media stance is more varied and diverse. That is a question of mostly problematic one being Prime Minister's visit to Yasukuni Shrine. On the issue of Prime Minister's visit to Yasukuni, each media organization has established their distinctive position, and as a result, opinions are much more divided and diverse. Newspapers, barring one, are rather opposed or clearly opposed to such a visit. The reasoning in opposition vary, but there is one thing in common, and that is the plain fact that a visit hurts relations with our neighbors, and for some media, more importantly, ties with America. However, the public opinion is more evenly divided, as shown in the different opinion polls, around 50-50. There is a stark contrast in the situation, as reports all over the world about Prime Minister's visit to Yasukuni Shrine these days is quite in unison against it. Foreign experts do know the very complex nature of the shrine, and David Pelling has explained it at length in his book. It may take a book to have it well explained, while the end result may not be necessarily an understanding, let alone an agreement on the parts of the readers. The Japanese media have long discussed the matter and have been divided, as shown in many polls. And there is an ideological division. There are politicians who want to revise the history. Foreign media hate them, but love to cover them to uncover the true thinking of the rest of the world. I would like to share with you three selected parts of three different editorial pieces from Yomiuri, Asahi, and Sankei Shimbun. I will start with maybe mine. Yomiuri Shimbun said in a piece on the 27th of December, we are concerned by the fact that the United States made an exceptional move to issue a statement saying the United States is disappointed that Japan's leadership has taken an action that would exacerbate tensions with Japan's neighbors. For the Prime Minister, who says the ties with the United States are of most importance, this must have been a miscalculation. Some of those who are close to the Prime Minister reportedly urged him to make a visit, arguing China and South Korea repeat Japan bashing with or without your visit. It doesn't matter if you went. It is unfortunate if the Prime Minister indeed made such a judgment because he was unable to find a way to improve ties with our neighbors. While Yasukuni itself states the doctrine does not allow a separation of souls that are enshrined, but strong voices exist against the wartime leaders and for the separation of Class A war criminals. Yasukuni has become a place which the emperor and the foreign dignitaries have difficulty in visiting. We should consider establishing a new national facility, including a non-religious one, so that everyone would be able to visit without fixation. Now, I picked up a short part from Asahi Shimbun, which is a respected big newspaper on the center of the left. There is nothing we do other than to be appalled by the irresponsibleness of this too introverted behavior. Not only because China and South Korea oppose to it, the Prime Minister's action has a negative effect on the wide range of issues, including how the Japanese should face up to the war and our national security and economy. It is clear that Yasukuni is a shrine with political nature whose aim is to justify the history. When the Prime Minister visits it, it sends a signal he agrees with the view. Now, I am going to read Sankei Shimbun again as a part of Sankei Shimbun's editorial. Many Japanese have been longing for this day. It is the responsibility of a Prime Minister to, on behalf of our people, mourn those who have died for the country. It is just proper that Mr. Abe has done it, and we commend the action. There are 2,460,000 souls of those who died for the country since the end of Edo era, enshrined at Yasukuni. They are the ones who sacrificed their precious lives to protect our nation, homeland, and families. It is an indispensable action for a Prime Minister to pay a visit to the shrine in view of defending our nation. We would like Mr. Abe to make an annual visit from the next year on to get back our normalcy as soon as possible. Now, I intently refrain from commenting on each editorial piece, but what I want to show is that the fact that each newspaper spent double the size of the everyday standard editorial piece. It is a topic of enormous complexity, and to write a readable piece with accuracy and logical consistency and good balance of salt and pepper is a huge task. Some prefer more salt and others pepper nonetheless. Given that call for restraint has long been there to our political leaders, I might voice my worry that the influence of traditional media like the one I work with may be on the decline. It is widely known the Prime Minister's visit to Yasukuni was liked on the social networking site by more than 30,000 clicks within 4 hours from the event, and the Prime Minister was reportedly well aware of it. I have to wonder if the collective effort in each newspaper company by experienced journalists to generate a single consistent piece of editorial is now overwhelmed by a number of clicks. But there has to be some solution to this question, as this is a very emotional one and has all ingredients for damaging our relations with our friends and partners. Now, I would rather stop it here. Yeah.
We can pick up other
time.
thoughts.
Yes, I will follow up with other comments from others.
Thanks very much.
Great. Well, so thank you for the fascinating discussion and the opening of the discussion. I mean, one of the things I was going to say was that I was going to talk about the polarization of the Chinese and the Japanese press, and that the Japanese press was had become quite loath to criticize Mr. Abe. But I mean, I must confess that I'm actually quite surprised at the variety of leaders. And if you'd have read out those 3 leaders without my or editorials, sorry, leaders is a very journalistic phrase. If you'd have read out those 3 editorials without my knowing, I might have said that the Yomiuri was the Asahi, actually. I mean, I was quite surprised at basically saying that there should be a secular site, and that Yasukuni was kind of irredeemably political. Anyway, just let me go through sort of some of the points that I was going to make. I should start off by saying I'm not very used to talking about journalism and journalists. Navel gazing is not something that I think we should indulge in too often, and I think it's important that journalists don't take themselves too seriously. So I just start off with that remark. This was in a sense kicked off, funnily enough, by my own newspaper and by a colleague of mine, Gideon Rachman, who interviewed Shinzo Abe on stage at Davos. And I reread the piece that he wrote, where he basically asked Prime Minister Abe, did Prime Minister Abe think that there was any danger of conflict between Japan and China? And he sort of expected Abe to say, no, of course not, this would be impossible, we're much too, there's too much at stake. And Abe didn't say that. He said, or at least he's reported to have said, because there is some dispute about the wording. But he said he couldn't rule this out because the situation was very tense, and that one should think about 1914 when Britain and Germany supposedly couldn't possibly go to war because their economies were so interlinked, and yet this didn't prevent a war. Now, this comment by Prime Minister Abe, I find entirely uncontroversial. It seems to me a perfectly reasonable statement of the situation that we have in Northeast Asia at the moment. It is a comment that Gideon Rachman himself has made. It was almost as though Shinzo Abe was quoting Gideon back to himself. It's a statement that I've made more or less in different ways. And so I have to admit that I was quite surprised at the controversy, and this became an enormously controversial thing. Partly, I think, because it was picked up by Beijing, who sort of accused Mr. Abe of warmongering, and then it sort of went backwards and forwards, and this became known, I think, as a sort of a very irresponsible thing to have said. And for me, what that shows is just how, sort of what an echo chamber this has all become. Because, especially in the context of Davos, where the idea is that you kick around these sort of ideas, this was a remarkably uncontroversial thing to say. So that's where I'll sort of start. The second point I'd like to make is that, and I think it's in a sense doubly important to make it to largely a Japanese audience, is that China has made some progress in the debate over the Senkaku Diaoyu, and I deliberately, and people who may have been here before, I deliberately say Senkaku Diaoyu because for a number of reasons. 3 or 4 years ago, the term Diaoyu would not have tripped off my tongue. I vaguely knew that that's what the Chinese called it, but you know, if I'd have been writing an article, I wouldn't have felt obliged to use that word because, you know, these were sort of clearly administered by Japan. You know, I knew there was a dispute, but the dispute wasn't kind of live. But the dispute, for a number of reasons, and I won't kind of retrace all of that, has become now live. And I think China has succeeded. I mean, if we're talking, because we are talking about journalism and in a sense, rhetoric and propaganda, I think China has succeeded, whether Japan likes it or not, in kind of opening up the debate now. So now everybody who sort of is paying any attention knows that there is a dispute, and like a serious dispute over these islands. And you know, moving from the journalistic world to the kind of the real world around the islands themselves. I mean, I think China's aim is to challenge what has been incontrovertible until very recently, which is that these are islands administered by Japan. But now it's sort of becoming, I mean, they're still administered by Japan, but you know, at any time of any day, there might be Chinese ships around there. And this is becoming sort of murkier and murkier. You could see a situation in a few years where it might be hard to say unequivocally these are now administered by Japan. And you may say they are sort of administered by both, you know, in the air, on the water. And of course, if you go back to the US-Japan Security Treaty and Washington's position on the islands, Washington does not take a position. It does not say the islands are Japanese. What Washington says is the islands are administered by Japan, and therefore they come under the remit of the US-Japan Security Treaty. So if the issue or not of whether the islands are actually administered by Japan becomes ambiguous, then maybe the US security guarantee becomes ambiguous. And I think even now, I mean, I was in Tokyo a few weeks ago giving a talk, and somebody stood up at the back quite angry, I think from Guy Michio from the Foreign Ministry, but I think he was retired. And he said, now we know that we can't rely on America anymore. And this is becoming a kind of a creeping fear in Japan, I think. So the point I sort of want to make is that we need to be aware that in this kind of very narrow, in a sense, kind of quite petty dispute, China is sort of making some progress. And I think that the assumption in Japan, which one also needs to be careful about, the assumption in Japan can be the following. You know, Japan is an ally of America. Japan is democratic. Japan has never fired a shot since 1945. China is communist. China is big and threatening. China is a destabilizing factor. Therefore, and China is not an ally in the same way of the US as Japan is. Therefore, the world will take Japan's side in all these disputes. I think the last thing, the ergo, the therefore, is kind of wrong. And that assumption is a little bit dangerous. There are a few reasons for that. One is, I think that you know, in the 60s and 70s, if you went to Washington, what you had was lots of Japanophiles. Japan was the up-and-coming nation. People were studying Japanese. People were learning Japanese history. Japan was the US ally. And increasingly, obviously, you now have lots of Japanese Sinophiles. This doesn't mean that they love everything that China does. Many American Sinophiles, you know, don't like the Communist Party at all, don't like authoritarian China. But they're steeped in Chinese history. They speak and read Chinese fluently. You know, to some extent, they will begin to see the world through Chinese eyes. And if you see the world through Chinese eyes, the point, you know, to say these islands are definitively Japanese doesn't actually look very realistic. You know, there is an ambiguity, and so I think Japan needs to sort of be aware of that. The second point I'd make is that, you know, China, being an authoritarian government, suppressing its own journalists, clamping down on free speech. Although there's a lot more free speech in China than I think people realise. But nonetheless, of course, China can come across as very clumsy in the outside world. And the idea that China wants soft power, that's very hard for China to get, given the system that it has. But I would also say that Japan can come across as extraordinarily clumsy as well. And it ought not to. There it is, a democracy. There it is, it has a free press. And yet sometimes Japan's diplomacy, and even the way non-diplomats kind of present the Japanese case. Hayashi-san is absolutely not included in this, because I think he gave an absolutely excellent presentation. But it can come across as very clumsy. So let me, Gideon Rachman again, and Gideon, who I saw in a piece that was written by a Japanese congressman, I think. He said that Gideon was clearly representing the case of the Chinese Communist Party, which is if you know anything about Gideon, this is such a mischaracterization. It just shows how sort of strange the debate has got. So Gideon, anyway, wrote a piece. Gideon, not in the pay of the Chinese Communist Party, wrote a piece in which he pointed out some of these clumsy diplomatic gaffes. He called them gaffes by Japan. For example, Shinzo Abe appeared in a photo shot in a trainer jet. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong, I think, with Shinzo Abe's ambition to at least talk about rewriting the constitution. But on the side of the jet was written 731. Now, many of you will know that 731 was a camp in Manchuria where experiments were carried out on live human beings. Now, Gideon happened to be in Korea when this photo came out, and every Korean he met said that this must have been deliberate. It must have been Abe saying, yeah, we don't care. This was our camp, and we're not ashamed of it. Now, I think this was not the case, but it shows a certain kind of insensitivity. Why not 732 or 64 or 1 or 999 of all the numbers? Taro Aso's remarks about changing the constitution, about how Adolf Hitler showed the way because the constitution was changed without anybody noticing. Of all the historical figures to pick. So Japan, does often shoot itself in the foot. And the Yasukuni case, I could go on for hours about Yasukuni, and don't worry, I've got 2 minutes myself. It said, please go on for 1 hour about Yasukuni. I'm certainly not going to, but however much you explain Yasukuni, in however sympathetic from the kind of, the explaining why a Japanese Prime Minister could go to Yasukuni, it is, I think, inexplicable, even to Japan's allies, let alone those who suffered during the war. Just the presence of the Yushikan Museum next to the Yasukuni site kind of makes this, I think, an impossible place for a Japanese Prime Minister to go to and not expect kind of flack. And of course, as you pointed out, the emperor himself does not go to Yasukuni. And then just finally, I've got many other points, but I'll just stop here. And it's in a sense in the same vein. The Japanese, I think, sometimes take for granted the US alliance and that the US will therefore understand. It's a point I kind of made before, but the US will therefore understand everything that comes out of Japan. And therefore there was complete shock when Caroline Kennedy, the US Embassy in Japan, expressed its disappointment that Shinzo Abe had visited Yasukuni, and nobody had seen this coming because Iijima, the man mentioned, I think, or alluded to in the Yomiuri Shimbun article, had gone to Washington and had come back with supposedly saying that, don't worry, it's fine, the Americans are okay with it, you don't need to worry. Just to end on one point, so I wrote in a column of mine, the word for disappointment in Japanese, as many of you will know, is shitsubo, which sounds it sounds much worse in Japanese than it does in English, disappointed. So I wrote in a column that was when the shitsubo really hit the fan. And I have to tell you that this was cut out of my article on the grounds that it was in poor taste. So it's not only China and it's not only Japan that don't allow their journalists total freedom of expression. Just let them know.
Thank you very much. Dominic?
Well, both very, very illuminating talks. And I'll just try and sort of pick up on some things that both Michio and David have said. The ability in the whole region of people possibly not to understand other people's perspectives, I think is something that's worth bringing home. And also possibly the ability of many people in the region to hold two sort of quite different views in their minds at the same time. I was in San Francisco just a couple of weeks ago and bumped into an old acquaintance from Tokyo in the St. Francis Hotel, which was briefly General MacArthur's headquarters. And Kawahara-san, he's close to retirement, I knew he was a fairly conservative type, but I mean, one of the delights to him of staying there was precisely that General MacArthur had done too. He asked me over a drink what I thought of the Abe government, and I said, when there's such a good story for Japan to tell about its post-war experience and how it has, Japan's aid and example really sort of led the way in an Asian economic miracle, how Japan's leaders keep reverting to the past. And he said, I know that Abe, he's always apologizing. We, of course, in terms of sort of history, we journalists get a fair bit of it from probably all sides at the sort of height of the sort of early tensions over the Senkaku Jiayu Islands in late 2011. We were receiving delegations from both the Chinese embassy, clutching great rolls of maps, and also from the Japanese embassy, and I found myself shuttling from the 13th floor to the 12th floor so that the two sides wouldn't meet each other. But at some point I thought, well, damn it, no, you should both meet. And in a way, the sort of nadir of this sort of public relations exercise by both sides was, of course, earlier this year with the famous Voldemort editorials. Now, I mean, I have to give the Chinese ambassador full credit for the metaphor, because and he knows Harry Potter far better than I, it's clear. But it was a brilliant thing comparing the Yasukuni Shrine to the Horcrux. But to sort of echo David's point, I mean, then with the response from the Japanese ambassador, and then an excruciating session on Newsnight, when I think sort of nobody did themselves credit, including Paxman. It was quite clear that in this sort of war of words, which we at The Economist compared to sort of viewing with alarm a dinner party where the guests are sort of threatening to turn to fisticuffs, that it did neither side any good. Certainly not Japan, because the approach was sort of kind of petty name-calling, ineffective, which I think speaks to some of David's points about Japanese diplomacy more generally. I've rarely met more intelligent individuals as Japanese diplomats, and if there are any in the room, I don't mean to insult them at all, but there is sometimes, it seems to me, a sort of inflexibility and lack of creativity, which does Japan no favours. But although in terms of the sort of spin and the use of the metaphor, I think China showed itself in public relations terms to be far more professional, and the editorials that appeared in this country were repeated all the way around the world, including in Africa. It did no favours to the Chinese either, and I think one example of this is that since tensions have risen, in particular over the Senkaku Jiayu Islands, but also, of course, over Chinese incursions into the South China Sea, more and more of the region is less bothered by Mr. Abe's visits to Yasukuni, much more concerned to know that Japan will join others in resisting Chinese bullying, aggression, assertion. There's a cottage industry in historical parallels, and the FT has been a font of it. I agree, it does seem likely that Mr. Abe took Gideon's and Martin Wolf's comparisons to Germany and Britain in 1940 to heart and decided to use that parallel. I agree with David that I don't think it's nearly as controversial a statement as people made out. I wonder whether there's another parallel. Which parallels are useful, comparisons are useful only so far as they go, if not taken too literally. But the comparison that I haven't heard of is China's behaviour today with Japan's at the end of the First World War. And it seems to me that neither side wants to make this, it suits neither side to make this comparison. But nevertheless, I think it exists. Japan, at the close of the First World War, felt somewhat aggrieved in not getting a good settlement out of the Treaty of Versailles. It felt itself to be, in effect, contained by Western imperialist powers that prevented Japan, as it saw it, from taking its seat at the high table. It felt that for economic success it needed continental expansion. At home, a fast urbanizing population had growing nationalist demands, a sense of victimhood mixed with a sort of dangerous and heady brew of of nationalist chauvinism drove Japan first of all into the Siberian intervention and then into all sorts of other adventures. The rhetoric today that you read in China is astonishingly similar. Of course, for the last 2 or 3 decades, China has, as a matter of policy, instilled in its education that sense of victimhood. The sort of rabid nationalism that you find on Weibo, but not only that, there are more views, I absolutely concede, but there is a strong sense of nationalism. The language is nearly identical with Japan's language a century ago. The difference, of course, is that China's expansion is a maritime one rather than, as Japan's was a century ago, a continental one. And I would say probably thank God for that, because I think you can do less damage at sea.
It's a sailor speaking, is it?
I'll stop there. David still has a book in him on Yasukuni. I think there's also a book on Okinawa and on the forgotten history of the Ryukyu kingdom, which was snuffed out by Japan in the late 19th century. And I think that one sort of modern day relevance of this of its history is obviously sort of how the Senkaku Islands came into sort of Japanese consciousness. But another aspect has precisely to do with the US. It's a matter of American policy to say that it has no view on territoriality. But from the mid-19th century, of course, the US has been deeply involved in this part of the world, and if it wasn't for Perry's black ships, Japan wouldn't have seen the threat coming from the southwest and wouldn't have annexed the Ryukyu kingdom in the way it did. The Senkaku Jiayu Islands, just very briefly, were sort of stepping stones on the way to Fujian province, Tranzhou, that was used by the tribute ships when the Ryukyu kingdom was paying tribute very cleverly to both China and Japan, and not telling the other about the other. And it was Okinawan crews who used the islands as a stepping stone. China has had no knowledge of these islands except for people using them on their way to the Ryukyu kingdom.